Howdy, folks. Dr. Will Wong here. Let me cover a question that I answered for a doc. And his question was, dealing with inflammation, which I know is the cause of most health conditions and illnesses, would you say that the consumption of alcohol induces inflammation because of its effects on the total body from head to toe and in between? And over the years of consumption can cause issues relating to fibrosis and i.e. alcoholic-induced cirrhosis and fatty liver, other damages to the liver, and alcohol-induced diabetes because it necessitates the systemic enzymes needed for health maintenance be used to try to reduce pancreatic inflammation and are not available elsewhere. I'd love to hear your take on this. And my answer is howdy. While I'm thinking about this point, let me give you my 2 cents on the matter. Drinking does not cause diabetes. Take a look at the most hypoglycemic races of man, the Scandinavians, the Irish, and the American Indians. Collectively, they all over-imbibe. But being hypoglycemic, they do so to get the fastest hit of sugar that they can, which is alcohol. So they are pre-diabetic to begin with, and because they are so, they drink a steady source of simple sugar to compensate. That's an entirely different way of looking at the problem of both diabetes and alcoholism, but it requires one to junk the BS politically correct notion that everyone is the same and equal. That holds true under the law, but physiologically, it is unscientific and easily disprovable bullshit. There are physiologic differences between the races and subraces of man, and those differences and predispositions are genetically hardwired. In the days before the late 1970s, when physical anthropology became politically correct, and both it and med school pediatrics class taught the differences in growth and development timetables, neurological development, brain weight, and susceptibilities to disease of different types of humans, somewhere along the line, all that knowledge was junked to foster the everyone is the same narrative. How's that for different thinking? On inflammation, yes, that breeds diabetes. What causes the inflammation can range from being low on folic acid and B12, as those check C-reactive protein, to environmental and food allergies. For example, soy increases C-reactive protein and homocysteine, which equals inflammation. Estradiol and estrol will do the same. Add to these stress and work factors. In 2005, when I taught that there was a fibrosis growth in the pancreas of diabetics due to the inflammation, a number of diabeticians took me to task, and we had a fairly lively debate. It didn't take long afterwards for amyloid deposits, i.e. fibrosis, to be found in the diabetic pancreases. Now, that's also about the time when we got the news that zinc was needed to make insulin and could not be made without it. And that made me remember a finding by Dr. Abram Burr. By the way, Dr. Abram Burr was an anesthesiologist, graduate of McGill Med School in Montreal, and the number one homeopathic doc in the world. He found that all diabetic patients that he had all tested very low on zinc levels. And between the combination of knowledge of the fibrosis in the pancreas plus the need for zinc to make insulin, we helped a good many type 1 diabetics. As to type 2, that's still a mystery to me. Hope these ideas spark newer ideas and directions. Be well and God bless. Dr. Wong. And yes, I know the U.S. is a country of mutts. Even the folks who think that they're lily white down in Louisiana have been found to be at least 18% black. Asians, especially Chinese, are really bad at not being able to tolerate alcohol very well, even though some Chinese are voracious drinkers. My point in pointing out who the most hypoglycemic folks are wasn't to diss on race, wasn't to criticize people for their race. It was to show that the hypoglycemia leading to diabetes is hardwired. Now, since most of us in the U.S. are mutts, we're a combination of different races and different sub-races. That means we have a genetic mix where the tendency for hypoglycemia is hardwired in. I, for example, got it from my maternal mother's lineage. Both my mother and her father were hypoglycemic diabetic. And unfortunately, I didn't skip those genes. So it's the hypoglycemia and the extreme hypoglycemia that makes people crave sweets because they're fast hits of sugar, and the hypoglycemic is low on blood sugar. It would seem that hypoglycemia is the antithesis to diabetes, but hypoglycemia is what leads into diabetes. Decades ago, when Dr. Carlton Fredericks first started talking about hypoglycemia, the entire medical world said the problem didn't really exist and criticized him for pointing out that the problem was actually fairly widespread. Doctors then couldn't see the connection between having low blood sugar and, alternately, having high blood sugar. They now know better, but if they had come to their realizations earlier, perhaps medicine would have never have gone on its high carbohydrate advocacy during the 70s, 80s, 90s, and well into the 2000s. That advocacy for a high carbohydrate diet helped to spark the diabetic epidemic along, whereas from the 1970s, we have 73% more people being diabetic and overweight than we did before. But again, I'm losing my point here. Alcoholism doesn't necessarily cause diabetes. Alcoholism is a sign that a person may become diabetic because they are low on blood sugar, they are hypoglycemic, and most all hypoglycemics later on in life become diabetic. So if we can start regulating sugars and starches early on in the life of a hypoglycemic, we might be able to prevent them from becoming diabetic. If we can introduce slow burning sources of energy like more protein instead of eating sweets and carbohydrates to supply the needed blood sugar. Protein has a longer energy profile. Eating protein will cause an increase in energy that will last for 6 to 8 hours. Eating sugars and simple carbs will cause a burst of energy suddenly, but it's gone in 12 to 20 minutes, leaving you lower in blood sugar than you were before the hit of sugar, which is why alcoholics need to keep on drinking. Those addicted to sweets reach for the next pastry or the next piece of candy. If instead, knowing that we hit low blood sugar between 2 and 4 a.m. and 2 and 4 p.m., if the first thing in the morning we did was, let's say, have supper instead of breakfast, have a good high-protein meal with minimal carbs, that will last us throughout most of the day. If we repeated the protein hit again during lunch, that would keep us from fizzing out between 2 and 4 p.m. These were the things that were advocated by Dr. Carlton Fredericks, and medicine soundly criticized him and rebuked him and told him that the high carbohydrate diet was the best diet that anyone could ever have because carbohydrates cause energy. Well, what happens when you don't burn them off? When you don't burn off all those carbs running marathons, because that's where the high carbohydrate diet came from, was from marathoning. What happens when you don't burn it off? It turns into fat. And that causes all sorts of other problems. All that extra sugar eventually burns out your pancreas's ability to create insulin. And where does that leave you? It leaves you being diabetic. And please understand, I am no way advocating alcoholism, but I'm pointing out that medicine has put the cart before the horse in blaming alcoholism for diabetes. It's actually the other way around. On that note, I wish you God's blessings. Be well, and I'll chat with you again next time. Bye-bye.